The Forgotten Corner. Elara presided over the West Wing's neglected reaches, a realm where dust motes swirled in sunbeams piercing grimy panes, largely untouched by the castle's vibrant pulse. Her hands, calloused and faintly etched with the silvery lines of countless forgotten chores, propelled a heavy broom across the flagstone, stirring up eddies of history. Most days she flitted through the castle like a phantom, a barely perceptible flicker in the periphery of its grand inhabitants. Alphas and betas, draped in finery and absorbed in their own concerns, swept past her as if she were an architectural detail, an inconvenient, silent fixture. She didn't mind. Obscurity was a shield, a quiet solace in a life that had once been anything but. Sometimes the faint aroma of lavender and polished wood would snag a memory, a soft, poignant ache in her chest. She'd briefly close her eyes, her mind instantly transported to her old pack's sprawling, welcoming den. Her mother's laughter, like chimes in a summer breeze, resonated in her thoughts. Her father's grounding scent of pine and rich earth, the joyful romps with other Omega pups tumbling through sun-dappled clearings, their innocence unburdened by life's harsh realities. They were all gone now, a plague, a rival pack's brutal ambition, a shift in allegiances. The details had blurred into a singular, agonizing void. She was the last spark of a once roaring blaze, rescued and then overlooked by the very people who'd pledged sanctuary. A loud clang from the main kitchen, a universe away from her quiet corner, jolted her back to the present. The rhythmic thud of a cleaver on wood, the hiss of boiling water, and the boisterous shouts of the head cook, formidable Beta Greta, composed the soundtrack to her daily toil. Her presence was required, always functional, rarely acknowledged. Her kitchen shift was a precisely choreographed ballet of labor. She separated blemished apples from flawless ones, peeled potatoes until her fingertips stung, and scoured pots until they gleamed like polished silver. Greta, a woman whose spirit was as robust as her voice, afforded Elara a grudging respect, a silent nod that spoke volumes in a place where words often cut deep. "Elara, these greens need washing. Don't dawdle." Greta would boom, yet a flicker of concern would cross her eyes when she believed no one watched. The other servants, mostly younger Omegas aspiring to climb the social ladder through favorable placements, kept their distance. Elara embodied a cautionary tale, a dissolved pack, a life unmoored, relegated to the lowest rung. Her quiet demeanor was often mistaken for sullenness, her gentle gaze for a lack of ambition. They failed to perceive the keen observation behind her eyes, the swift assessment of situations, the quiet resilience that had sustained her through unimaginable loss. One afternoon, as she navigated the bustling great hall with a heavy tray of empty flagons toward the scullery, a stray pup, perhaps 6 years old, stumbled, scattering a basket of fresh bread across the polished marble. The pup, eyes wide with terror, whimpered, bracing for the inevitable scolding. Elara paused, carefully leaning her tray against the wall. She knelt, her movements fluid and unhurried, gathering the loaves, gently brushing away stray crumbs. "It's all right, little one," she murmured, her voice soft as velvet. "No harm done." She offered the pup a small, reassuring smile, a rare glimpse of the warmth she typically concealed. The pup, a young Omega named Finn, gazed up at her with a mix of surprise and gratitude, his fear momentarily forgotten. Later, as the castle settled into the hushed anticipation of evening, Elara retreated to her meagre cot in the servants' quarters. The room was stark, a thin mattress, a rough wool blanket, and a single wooden chest holding her few possessions. Her sole indulgence was a smooth, river-worn stone she'd found near her old pack's den, a tangible link to a past that sometimes felt like a dream. She ran her thumb over its cool surface, the familiar texture a balm to her weary spirit. The aroma of roasting game drifted from the kitchens below, signalling the evening feast for the higher ranks. For Elara, dinner would be a bowl of lukewarm stew, eaten in silence, far from the boisterous laughter of the main dining hall. It was a solitary existence, yes, but also a predictable one. Safe, a quiet haven in a cacophonous world, where she could simply be, unburdened by expectations, unmarred by further sorrow. For now, that was enough. Yet, even in the quietest corners, seeds of change could sometimes take root, unseen, unheard, awaiting the opportune moment to blossom. A spark of bravery. The great hall thrummed with a boisterous energy that Elara rarely witnessed, let alone participated in. Tonight, the castle hosted a mid-harvest feast, a vibrant tapestry of laughter, clinking goblets, and the rich scent of roasted boar and spiced wine. Even the usually sombre stone walls seemed to shimmer under the glow of countless candles and roaring hearths. Servants, including Elara, weaved through the throng, replenishing platters and refilling horns, their movements a practiced dance around the revellers. Elara moved with her usual quiet efficiency, her eyes, despite her outward focus on the task at hand, absorbing every detail. She noted the king's effortless command, even in celebration, his deep laugh carrying over the din as he conversed with his inner circle. She saw the playful jostling between young warriors and the elegant whispered conversations of the court ladies. For a brief moment, the suffocating cloak of her grief lightened, replaced by a quiet appreciation for the vibrant life around her. A life she was a part of, albeit from its periphery. A high-pitched shriek, sudden and raw, cleaved through the festive air, instantly silencing the hall. Every head whipped towards the source. Near the eastern entrance, a monstrous grey wolf, its fur matted and streaked with blood, stood snarling, its yellow eyes blazing with feral hunger. Panic, a visceral, primal fear, rippled through the gathered guests, freezing many in their seats. This was no ordinary rogue. Its size and the sheer malevolence radiating from it spoke of something darker, something corrupted. Before anyone could react, the beast lunged, a blur of grey fur and snapping teeth. Its target was not a warrior or a courtier, but a small child, a boy no older than 5, who had wandered too close to the edge of the crowd, captivated by a juggling jester moments before. The child, dressed in a miniature tunic of the royal blue, stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror, utterly defenseless. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Guards, momentarily stunned by the audacity of the attack, scrambled for their weapons. Alpha King Kalin, already on his feet, roared a command, his voice a guttural thunder that shook the very foundations of the hall, but the wolf was too fast. It was mere feet from the boy, its jaws already opening to seize him. Elara, who had been refilling a pitcher of wine near the child's table, didn't think. Her body reacted, driven by an instinct far deeper than any fear. Later, she wouldn't remember the burning in her lungs, the desperate surge of adrenaline. All she knew was the wolf's intent, the child's terror. With a guttural cry ripped from her own throat, a sound she hadn't known she possessed, she lunged forward. Her movement was clumsy, unrefined, but fueled by sheer desperation. She threw herself at the child, not to fight the wolf, but to shield him. She shoved him with all her meager strength, sending him sprawling under the heavy oak table, just as the rogue's jaws snapped shut on empty air where the boy had been. The force of her push sent Elara off balance, and she tumbled to the flagstone floor, landing hard. The wolf, snarling with frustrated rage, turned its attention to her. Its eyes, burning like malevolent embers, fixed on her. She saw the glint of its fangs, smelled its foul breath, felt the terrifying heat of its presence. It was so close, too close. A shadow fell over her, massive and swift. Before the rogue could strike again, a heavy, muscled body slammed into it. Alpha King Kaelin, sword drawn and glinting, had reached them. The fight was brutal, a whirlwind of snapping jaws, razor claws, and the clang of steel. The Alpha King moved with a terrifying grace, his every strike precise and powerful. The corrupted wolf, though large and vicious, was no match for the king's skill and strength. Within moments, with a final, desperate howl, the beast lay still, its lifeblood staining the polished floor. Silence descended once more, heavier and more profound than before. The joyous feast was irrevocably broken. All eyes, which had been fixed on the deadly struggle, now shifted. They fell first on the fallen wolf, then on the Alpha King, his chest heaving, his sword still dripping. Finally they landed on Elara, still sprawled on the floor, trembling but otherwise unharmed. The small boy, peeking out from under the table, began to whimper, then to cry. Alpha King Kaelin turned, his gaze sweeping over the silent hall, then settling on Elara. His stern features, usually so unreadable, held an expression she couldn't quite decipher. A flicker of surprise, a hint of something akin to awe, and an undeniable intensity that made her breath catch. He sheathed his sword, its metallic click echoing in the stillness. Then, without a word, he knelt beside her, his large hand gently touching her shoulder. The touch, though brief, was electric, a jolt of unexpected connection. "Are you harmed, Omega?" he asked, his voice deep and surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the battle roar of moments before. Elara, her throat tight with a mixture of terror and a strange, unfamiliar warmth, could only shake her head, her gaze fixed on the powerful hand still resting on her shoulder. The Alpha King, the most powerful man in the kingdom, had just spoken directly to her, had knelt for her. It was an unprecedented act, one that would undoubtedly send ripples of shock and curiosity through the entire court. She had sought obscurity, craved invisibility, but in a single impulsive act of bravery, she had inadvertently drawn the attention of the one person whose gaze could change everything. He rose, his gaze still holding hers for a beat longer than necessary, before turning to the whimpering child. He offered the boy a reassuring smile, then scooped him into his arms, but not before glancing back at Elara, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The feast might be over, but for Elara, something far more profound had just begun. The king's decree. A hush, thick and suffocating, descended upon the feasting hall. The lingering scent of roasted meats and sweet wine was suddenly overwhelmed by the metallic tang of fear and anticipation. Kaelin, still kneeling before Elara, his eyes locked with hers, felt the ripple of shock emanating from every corner of the room. He could hear the frantic whispers that had erupted and then abruptly ceased, replaced by a collective, breathless silence. The weight of his gaze, so intense and unwavering, made Elara's breath catch in her throat. She was acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes now fixed upon her, a stark contrast to the invisibility she had cultivated for years. Then, with a deliberate slowness that only amplified the tension, Kaelin rose. His movement was fluid, powerful, drawing every eye. He did not immediately address the court, but instead took a single, significant step closer to Elara, positioning himself almost as a shield. The gesture was subtle, yet potent. He then turned to face the assembly, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding. "Let it be known." His voice resonated, deep and clear, cutting through the heavy air, that Elara, a servant of this household, has, by her selfless act, demonstrated courage and a fierce protective instinct worthy of the highest regard. He paused, allowing his words to sink in, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the Alpha families. From this moment forward, Elara is under my personal protection. She will be afforded every courtesy and safety that my own blood enjoys. Any slight against her, any harm that befalls her, will be met with the full and unwavering might of the crown. A collective gasp, louder this time, rippled through the hall. Faces contorted in disbelief, anger, and outrage. This was not merely a commendation, it was an unprecedented decree. For an Alpha King to declare personal protection over a nameless servant, an Omega from a dissolved pack, was an affront to tradition, to status, to the very fabric of their society. Lady Lyra, perched at a prominent table beside her Alpha father, felt a furious blush creep up her neck, her carefully composed facade cracked, revealing a flash of venomous disdain. Her eyes, usually sparkling with calculated charm, narrowed into slits as she glared at Elara. How dare this nobody usurp their attention, their standing? This was an insult to every eligible female of noble birth, every Alpha daughter vying for the king's favour. The audacity! Elder Rowan, seated at the high table, stroked his grizzled beard, his brow furrowed in a deep frown. His eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and observant. He watched Kaelin, then Elara, then the seething faces of the court. He understood the king's intent, a reward for bravery, a statement against the encroaching darkness, but he also saw the immediate, dangerous fallout. This decree, while born of justice, was a political earthquake. Elara felt her knees tremble. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The king's words, a thunderclap in the quiet hall, had irrevocably shattered the protective shell of her anonymity. She was no longer just Elara, the quiet servant. She was Elara under the king's protection, a title that felt both like a gilded cage and a target painted squarely on her back. The sudden, intense scrutiny was overwhelming. She could feel the prickle of hostile stares, the weight of judgment from every direction. The faces of the Alpha families, previously a blur of indifference, were now sharply defined, etched with varying degrees of shock, resentment, and barely concealed fury. A cold dread seeped into her bones. Her act had saved a child, yes, but it had also, in one swift, terrifying moment, propelled her into a spotlight she had always meticulously avoided. She was exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone, despite the king's looming presence. The silence that had once protected her was gone, replaced by the deafening roar of 1,000 unspoken accusations. Kaelin, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the brewing storm, met the challenging stares of his court with an unyielding gaze. He had made his decision, and he would not waver. The stability of the kingdom was paramount, and if that meant upending ancient customs for a true act of courage, then so be it. He held Elara's safety above all else, even if it meant alienating those who saw her as nothing more than a pawn, or worse, a threat. The battle lines, he knew, had just been drawn. Whispers and weeds. The gilded halls, once a blur of polished stone and hushed footsteps to Elara, now felt like a stage, every corner a potential gallery of scrutinizing eyes. The king's decree had transformed her from an invisible fixture to an unavoidable spectacle. Whispers, once distant murmurs, now coalesced around her like a physical weight. An Omega, truly, she heard one lady titter, her voice laced with incredulity, as Elara passed a cluster of nobles near the solar. It's unheard of. The king must be indisposed. Her companion snorted, a delicate hand fluttering to her lips. Or perhaps he simply enjoys a scandal. Better than the usual dull, courtly affairs. The words, though not directed at her, prickled Elara's skin, leaving a cold residue in their wake. She kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, trying to project an indifference she didn't feel. The snubs were less subtle than the whispers. At dinner, a silver platter of roasted quail was offered to everyone at the king's table, then pointedly whisked away from Elara's reach just as she extended her hand. A blush crept up her neck, hot and mortifying. Later, a servant, accidentally, spilled a glass of wine on her simple tunic, forcing her to retreat and change, missing the evening's entertainment. Each slight, small on its own, chipped away at her fragile composure, reminding her of the chasm that still separated her from this world, despite the king's words. Lady Lyra, however, preferred direct confrontation to veiled insults. Her hostility was a tangible force, a storm front that preceded her. Elara felt its pressure most keenly during their shared duties, now unavoidable as Elara was often tasked with assisting the king's closest advisors. A cruel irony that placed her frequently in Lyra's orbit. "Still trailing after our sovereign like a lost pup, Omega?" Lyra's voice cut through the air one afternoon as Elara sorted scrolls in the king's antechamber. Lyra stood framed in the doorway, her dark gown a stark silhouette against the sunlit corridor, a half-smile playing on her lips, devoid of warmth. "Do you truly believe a few empty words from the king will change what you are?" Elara flinched, her fingers tightening on a parchment. "I am simply performing my duties, Lady Lyra." Lyra stepped closer, her scent, rich spices and something sharp, like crushed herbs, filling the small space. "Your duties, Elara, are a temporary indulgence. The king is fond of novelties, but novelties, like wildflowers, eventually wilt and are forgotten. Do not mistake a moment's curiosity for lasting regard." Her eyes, dark and piercing, raked over Elara's unassuming clothes. "You do not belong here, and everyone knows it." The words struck Elara with the force of a physical blow. She felt a familiar ache of loneliness, a yearning for a place where she wasn't constantly scrutinized, constantly judged. She longed for the quiet anonymity she'd once taken for granted. Seeking refuge from the suffocating atmosphere of the court, Elara found herself drawn to the palace's less frequented wings. One afternoon, following a crumbling stone path that wound behind the kitchens and storerooms, she stumbled upon a forgotten archway, choked with ivy and thorny brambles. Beyond it, a faint hint of green beckoned. Pushing through the dense foliage, she entered a space that felt like a secret world. It was a garden, or what remained of one. Once, clearly, it had been magnificent. Fountains lay cracked and dry, their basins filled with dead leaves. Statues of nymphs and satyrs were crumbling, their features obscured by moss. Yet, beneath the decay, a stubborn beauty persisted. Rose bushes, long untended, had climbed wild and sprawling, their thorns tangled but their buds still promising vibrant blooms. Fragrant jasmine wove through an ancient trellis, its white flowers delicate against the gnarled wood. A strange sense of peace settled over Elara. Here, away from the glittering, judging eyes, she felt a quiet kinship with the neglected space. This garden, like her, had been overlooked, its potential obscured by the weeds of time and neglect. She returned the next day, armed with a discarded trowel and a pair of rusty shears she'd found in a forgotten shed. With each weed she pulled, each dead branch she pruned, a small corner of the garden began to breathe again. Her hands, calloused from years of menial tasks, found a new purpose in the earth. The earthy scent of soil, the sharp tang of cut green, and the gentle hum of unseen insects became her companions. As she worked, the whispers of the court faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. The garden didn't judge her heritage or her status. It simply yielded to her touch, slowly revealing the beauty that lay beneath the layers of neglect. And in its quiet resurgence, Elara found a faint, echoing hope for her own. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could shed the weight of the court's disdain and connect with something real, something that responded to her effort. It was a silent testament to resilience, a reminder that even in desolation, beauty could be coaxed back to life. A king's observation. From the shadowed archway of the king's private study, Kaelin watched Elara. The grand, leaded windows offered a panoramic view of the lower gardens, a tapestry of manicured lawns and sculpted hedges, but his gaze was fixed on a more remote, untamed corner. There, amidst the riot of neglected flora, Elara moved with a quiet purpose that captivated him. His court, a viper's nest of ambition and pretense, rarely exhibited such unadorned sincerity. He had expected her to retreat, to cower under the relentless scrutiny. Instead, she had found solace in the forgotten. Each day, the Omega servant, now elevated to an uncomfortable prominence, would slip away from the stifling atmosphere of the castle's inner chambers, drawn by the silent call of the overgrown garden. Today, she knelt beside a bed of what looked like once vibrant roses, their petals now brittle and brown. Her fingers, surprisingly delicate yet calloused, brushed over the withered blooms, a gentle lament for their lost beauty. He saw her murmur something, a soft, almost inaudible whisper, as if consoling the wilting flowers. A flicker of light caught his eye as the sun, peeking through a break in the clouds, illuminated a small, vibrant patch of new growth beneath her hand. A tiny sprout, barely visible, pushing through the cracked earth. Elara's lips curved into a faint, genuine smile, a rare sight in the cold grandeur of the castle. It was a smile born not of social obligation or feigned pleasure, but of simple joy at life's persistence. This quiet strength, this unassuming kindness, set her apart from the preening alphas and plotting betas who populated his daily life. She was a different kind of power, a more profound one. Kaelin's thoughts drifted to the incident that had thrust her into his protection. The child, Lyra's own niece, teetering precariously on the precipice of the fountain, and Elara's swift, instinctive lunge, a selfless act, devoid of calculation or ambition, a stark contrast to the political chess games that consumed his court. He had seen the truth in her eyes that day, not fear, but fierce determination. He had made his decision then, and he had no regrets, despite the simmering resentment her presence now stirred. "Your Majesty." Alpha Thorn's voice, smooth as polished obsidian, cut through the quiet of the study. Kaelin turned, his expression carefully neutral. Thorn stood in the doorway, a scroll clutched in his hand, his eyes sharp and assessing. "A dispatch from the eastern borders. The skirmishes with the rogue packs are escalating." Kaelin took the scroll, his gaze briefly meeting Thorn's. He detected the unspoken question in the Alpha's eyes, the subtle shift in his posture. Thorn was always watching, always calculating. He would have noticed the direction of Kaelin's gaze. "I will review this immediately," Kaelin stated, unfurling the parchment. "See that the border patrols are reinforced. I want no further incursions." Thorn bowed, a slight, almost imperceptible curl of his lip betraying his true feelings. "As you command, Your Majesty." He lingered for a moment, his eyes sweeping over the window, then back to Kaelin. "It seems distractions abound within the castle walls these days. A shame when matters of state demand such focused attention." Kaelin's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what Thorn was implying. "My focus, Thorn, remains firmly on the well-being of my kingdom. Do not mistake compassion for weakness." Thorn offered a bland smile. "Of course not, Your Majesty. Only, perceived weakness can often be exploited. A king's strength is in his unwavering resolve." He exited, leaving Kaelin to the rustle of the parchment and the lingering scent of Thorn's expensive cologne. Outside the castle walls, cloaked figures moved with practiced stealth. One, perched high in the branches of an ancient oak, binoculars pressed to his eyes, swept his gaze across the castle's lower grounds. He saw the king, a formidable silhouette against the light, standing by the study window. His attention, however, was drawn to the secluded garden where the Omega worked. A small, almost insignificant detail, yet significant to the right observer. The spy lowered his binoculars, a grim smile touching his lips. He had noted the king's prolonged observation, the way his shoulders had seemed to relax ever so slightly as he watched the Omega. He had noted Thorn's swift, pointed departure. These were threads, delicate but strong, for his master to weave. He melted back into the shadows, a silent messenger of perceived vulnerability, carrying the seed of a new strategy back to Alpha Thorn. The game, it seemed, was growing more intricate. Shadows and secrets, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves still clung to Elara's clothes, a comforting contrast to the stale air of the castle's inner corridors. Evening had settled, painting the narrow windows in shades of bruised purple and dying orange. She carried a small basket of dried herbs, destined for the kitchens, a task she'd willingly taken on, eager to postpone her return to the increasingly stifling ladies' common room. The whispers there had grown sharper, the glances colder, since Kaelin's pronouncement. It was as if her very presence, once invisible, now cast an unbearable shadow. As she moved, her soft boots made little sound on the polished flagstones. The castle, a labyrinth of stone and shadow, was a different entity at night. Sounds carried, distorted and amplified, turning creaking timbers into groaning beasts and distant conversations into conspiratorial murmurs. She knew its hidden paths and forgotten stairwells, having navigated them for years as an unnoticed ghost. It was this familiarity that led her down a seldom-used service passage behind the tapestries of the East Wing, a shortcut to the lower kitchens. Meanwhile, in a secluded chamber deep within the castle's older, less frequented sections, Alpha Thorn stood before two figures cloaked in the muted browns and greys of the surrounding stone. The room was sparsely furnished, lit only by a single sputtering candle that cast dancing shadows across their impassive faces. The air, thick with the scent of old parchment and cold stone, vibrated with a suppressed energy. "The king's attention is divided." Thorn's voice was a low murmur, carefully modulated, devoid of the usual courtly pleasantries. He observes the Omega as a gardener, not as a threat to his stability. This is our advantage. He gestured vaguely towards a map unrolled on a heavy oak table, its surface scratched and worn. The summer solstice festival approaches, a time of celebration, of lowered guards, of distraction. One of the cloaked figures, a lean man whose eyes gleamed with cold intelligence, nodded almost imperceptibly. "The perimeter will be reinforced for the festival, Alpha. Extra patrols." Thorn dismissed the concern with a flick of his wrist. "Security will focus on the public areas, the outer walls. The king himself will be preoccupied with appearances. Our objective is not to breach the main defences. It is to infiltrate unseen, to gather precise intelligence on his inner circle, his personal guard rotations, the access points to his private chambers. We need to know who he truly trusts, beyond the courtly facade." "And the king's new pet?" The second spy, a woman whose voice was a rasp, inquired. "The Omega." A faint, almost imperceptible sneer touched Thorn's lips. She is a distraction, a curiosity. Her quarters are near the garden, isolated. She might even be useful if she inadvertently draws attention away from your true mission. He leaned closer to the map, his finger tracing a path through the castle's heart. The timing is critical. During the main procession, when the entire court is gathered in the grand courtyard, you will move through the old servant tunnels beneath the west wing. Their access point is in the abandoned stables, rarely patrolled. From there, it's a direct route. He lowered his voice further, a thread of steel woven into its silken texture. Your primary mission is reconnaissance, to identify vulnerabilities. But if the opportunity presents itself, a calculated disruption, a message to remind the king of his true responsibilities, of the fragility of his position, would not be unwelcome. Nothing that implicates us directly, of course. A staged incident, perhaps. A fire in a remote storeroom. A stolen document from a minor official's office. Something to shake the foundations, to sow discord. Elara, humming a soft, wordless tune, was nearing the convergence of the service passage and the main east wing corridor. She paused, adjusting the weight of her basket, when a sudden, sharp crackle of voices reached her from around the bend. They were hushed, urgent, and unfamiliar. Instinct, honed by years of avoiding unwanted attention, made her press herself back into the shadows of a recessed alcove, the basket clutched to her chest. "The old servant tunnels beneath the west wing," a man's voice, low and gravelly, drifted to her. "Access point in the abandoned stables." Then a woman's voice, raspy and dry as autumn leaves. "During the main procession, when the entire court is gathered in the grand courtyard." A calculated disruption. Elara's breath hitched. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. Disruption. During the festival, her mind, usually preoccupied with the simple rhythms of her day, raced. These weren't servants gossiping. The words felt heavy, sharp, like stones dropped into a still pond. She strained to hear more, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. Fire in a remote storeroom, a stolen document, sow discord. The words faded, swallowed by the castle's ancient stone. Footsteps receded, 2 distinct sets, moving away from her position, deeper into the castle's forgotten corners. Silence descended once more, but it was no longer the comforting quiet of the castle at rest. It was a silence pregnant with unspoken threats, a palpable tension that prickled Elara's skin. The basket of herbs felt suddenly heavy, its warmth a stark contrast to the icy dread that had seeped into her bones. She wasn't just an Omega servant anymore. She was a witness. And the knowledge she now carried felt like a dangerous, fragile burden. The summer solstice festival, a time of joy and celebration, was about to become something far more ominous. The Omega's warning. The scent of fear, acrid and metallic, clung to Elara like a shroud. Each beat of her heart echoed Thorn's hushed words, amplifying the weight of the secret she carried. The summer solstice festival. Hidden tunnels, calculated disruption. Her mind replayed the scene, the 2 cloaked figures like spectres in the pre-dawn gloom, their hushed tones a venomous promise. To tell Kaelin meant to risk everything, his disbelief, the court's ridicule, Thorn's wrath. But to stay silent meant the kingdom's peril, and the image of the child she'd saved, innocent and trusting, flashed before her eyes. The choice, though terrifying, was clear. She found herself outside Kaelin's study much later that day, the grand oak doors seeming to mock her peasant clothing. Her palms were slick, and her breath hitched with every imagined rejection. A guard, a burly beta with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, stood sentinel. I need to speak with the king," Elara managed, her voice a reedy whisper that barely carried beyond her lips. The guard's gaze swept over her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. His Majesty is engaged. It's urgent, for the kingdom, she insisted, finding a sudden wellspring of conviction. He studied her for another long moment, then with a curt nod, pushed open one of the massive doors. Inside, Kaelin sat behind a large, dark wood desk, parchment and quills scattered before him. The air in the room hummed with a quiet intensity, a stark contrast to the bustling energy outside. He looked up, his strong features etched with concentration, then softened, ever so slightly as he recognized her. "Elara," he acknowledged, his voice a deep baritone that resonated through the room. "What is it?" She stepped forward, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched. The words felt like stones in her throat. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice still trembling despite her efforts. "Last night, I overheard something important, about the summer solstice festival." Kaelin's eyes, usually a calm, deep sea, sharpened. He leaned forward, his posture radiating an unspoken command for her to continue. Drawing a ragged breath, Elara recounted the overheard conversation, the details tumbling out in a rush. She described Thorn's grim expression, the cloaked figures, the mention of tunnels, and the phrase, calculated disruption. Her voice gained strength as she spoke, fueled by the urgency of her message. When she finished, the room was silent save for the rapid beat of her own heart. Kaelin's gaze was unblinking, assessing. He didn't interrupt, didn't scoff. He simply listened, his attention absolute. A long moment passed, thick with unspoken questions. "Are you certain of what you heard, Elara?" he finally asked, his voice devoid of judgment, but with an underlying current of gravity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Every word," she affirmed, meeting his gaze with newfound resolve. He nodded slowly, then rose, his height commanding the space. He walked to a high window overlooking the bustling courtyard, his back to her, and for a terrifying moment, Elara feared he would dismiss her. Instead he turned back, his expression unreadable. "Summon Elder Rowan," he commanded the guard. Elder Rowan arrived swiftly, his silver hair a stark contrast to his dark robes. His eyes, though aged, held a keen intelligence that missed little. Kaelin relayed Elara's warning, his voice calm and concise, omitting no detail. Elder Rowan listened, his expression growing progressively more severe. "If this is true, Your Majesty, the implications are dire," Rowan stated, his voice a low rumble. "Thorn has been a loyal advisor for decades. To accuse him based on a servant's overheard words..." He trailed off, the unspoken skepticism palpable. Kaelin turned to Elara, his gaze piercing. "You are certain of Thorn's voice, Elara?" "Yes, Your Majesty. I've served in his household before," she replied, her voice firm. Kaelin looked from Elara to Rowan, then back to the window, his jaw tight. The weight of his decision hung heavy in the air. He could dismiss it as a servant's misunderstanding, fueled by fear or court gossip. Or he could trust the Omega who had, against all odds, shown him unwavering courage. He remembered her face when she'd pulled the child from the stampede, the fierce determination in her eyes. This was the same look. He made his choice. Regardless of who is involved, the intelligence warrants action. The summer solstice festival will proceed, but with heightened security. Every entry point, every shadow will be watched. We will prepare as if for battle. His voice, though measured, carried the undeniable ring of authority. "Elder Rowan, assemble the War Council. I want patrols doubled, the castle defences reviewed, and all tunnel access points sealed or heavily guarded. We will not be caught unawares." Rowan's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, then respect. As you command, Your Majesty. As Rowan bowed and exited, Kaelin turned back to Elara, the intensity in his gaze softening once more. You did well, Elara, he said, his voice quiet. You showed courage. Now rest. There will be much to do. The weight of his words, of his trust, settled upon her, heavy but strangely comforting. The kingdom might doubt her, but the king did not. The Festival of Fury. The scent of roasted meats and sweet honey wine hung heavy in the air, mingling with the heady perfume of night-blooming jasmine and the joyous din of the summer solstice festival. Lanterns, painstakingly crafted from iridescent beetle wings and translucent river reeds, cast a warm, flickering glow over the revellers. Laughter spilled from every corner of the courtyard, punctuated by the rhythmic pulse of drums and the lilt of a lute. Children, their faces sticky with berry tarts, chased each other through the crowd, their excited shrieks a counterpoint to the more sedate conversations of the adults. Elara, despite Kaelin's insistence that she rest, found herself drawn to the periphery of the celebration. She watched, a quiet observer, from the shadow of a gnarled oak, its ancient branches draped with garlands of wildflowers. The vibrant tapestry of life unfolding before her was a stark contrast to the grim warnings she had delivered. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. The king had prepared, yes, but the sheer joy of the moment felt terribly fragile. A sudden, jarring shift in the music, a discordant clang of metal, followed by a guttural roar that ripped through the festive sounds, shattered the tranquility. The laughter died, replaced by gasps of horror and the terrified screams of children. From the shadowed archways leading into the outer ward, a tide of dark-clad figures surged forward, their faces grim masks of intent. Alphathorn, his eyes alight with a cold, predatory gleam, led the charge, a gleaming blade held aloft. Chaos erupted. The festive crowd, moments ago a swirling mass of mirth, dissolved into a panicked stampede. Tables overturned, spilling food and drink onto the cobblestones. Lanterns swung wildly, some crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks. Thorn's warriors, lean and brutal, moved with practiced efficiency, cutting off escape routes, their focus solely on the heart of the courtyard. But Kaelin was ready. Before Thorn's pack could fully penetrate the main gathering, the king's own guard, armed and armoured, materialized from seemingly nowhere. They met the assault with a formidable, unwavering line of steel. The clash of blades, the shouts of command, and the snarls of fighting alphas replaced the music, creating a symphony of violence. Kaelin, a formidable figure even in the midst of pandemonium, moved with a controlled fury. His silver battle-axe, usually kept for ceremonial displays, became a blur of motion, deflecting blows and carving paths through Thorn's encroaching warriors. He was a whirlwind of power, his presence a rallying point for his beleaguered guards. He fought not with wild abandon, but with a strategic precision that was both terrifying and inspiring. Elara pushed back against the oak, watched the unfolding battle, her heart pounding against her ribs. She saw the sheer numbers of Thorn's pack, their relentless push, even against Kaelin's prepared defenses. They were trying to encircle him, to overwhelm him with sheer force. A cold dread seeped into her bones as she saw Thorn himself, a cunning predator, attempting to flank Kaelin, his eyes fixed on the king with murderous intent. Thorn's advance was slow, methodical, designed to draw Kaelin's attention, while another of his lieutenants distracted the king from the front. It was a classic pincer movement, one she had seen executed in old training exercises, though never with such deadly intent. Kaelin, focused on the immediate threats, was vulnerable. He was a formidable warrior, but even he could not fight on all sides at once. A fierce resolve ignited within Elara. She was an Omega, a servant, but she was not helpless. She knew this castle, its secret passages, its hidden conduits, better than almost anyone. Thorn had used the tunnels, but there were other ways, less obvious, less guarded, ways that could create a distraction, draw away some of Thorn's relentless pursuit. Without a moment's hesitation, Elara pushed away from the oak, weaving through the edges of the chaos. She moved with an almost ethereal grace, her small frame unnoticed amidst the larger, brawling figures. Her destination was a forgotten service entrance, hidden behind a tapestry depicting the first harvest. It led to a series of narrow, winding corridors, rarely used and often overlooked. Reaching the tapestry, she slipped behind it, her fingers fumbling with the stiff latch. It gave way with a soft click, opening into a dusty, lamplit passage. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of aged stone and disuse. She didn't light a torch, relying on the faint slivers of light filtering through cracks in the old stone. She knew this route, every twist and turn, every uneven step. Her heart hammered, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence of the passage. She ascended a narrow, spiraling staircase, her hand brushing against cold, damp stone. It led to a small, hidden alcove overlooking a segment of the courtyard where Thorn's warriors were pressing their attack most fiercely against Kaelin's struggling guards. Taking a deep breath, Elara reached for a stack of old, empty ale barrels that had been stored in the alcove, forgotten. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed them, one by one, towards the edge. The first one tumbled, crashing onto the cobblestones below with a deafening clatter, followed by another and another. They splintered and broke, creating a loud, attention-grabbing ruckus right behind the section of Thorn's forces that were attempting to encircle the king. Several of Thorn's warriors, startled by the sudden noise and the unexpected debris, spun around, their eyes scanning for the source of the diversion. Their formation faltered, their focus momentarily broken. A few, thinking it an unlooked-for reinforcement or a new threat, broke away from the main skirmish, moving towards the shadows where the barrels had fallen. It was a small window, a brief disruption, but it was enough. Kaelin, sensing the shift in pressure, seized the opportunity. He roared, his voice echoing above the din, and with renewed vigor drove back the immediate threats, momentarily regaining the upper hand. Elara watched for a heartbeat, seeing the king's forces rally, the momentary reprieve he had gained. She had done what she could. Now, she had to disappear before she was discovered. Victory and valor, the clang of steel on steel echoed through the grand hall, a brutal counterpoint to the shattered remnants of the festival's cheer. Kaelin, his face a mask of grim determination, moved with a controlled fury, each strike against Thorn's blade a testament to his lineage and training. Thorn, for all his arrogance, was a formidable opponent, his movements swift and unyielding, fueled by a desperation that bordered on madness. But Kaelin fought with the clear purpose of a king defending his home, his pack, his future. Thorn lunged, a wild, desperate thrust aimed at Kaelin's heart. Kaelin parried, the force of the blow jarring his arm, but he held firm. He saw an opening, a flicker of hesitation in Thorn's eyes, and seized it. With a roar that vibrated through the stone, Kaelin twisted, his sword a silver arc, and disarmed Thorn with a resounding crash. Thorn's weapon skittered across the polished floor, coming to rest near a discarded laurel wreath. Before Thorn could recover, Kaelin's blade was at his throat, cold and unforgiving. Thorn's breath hitched, his eyes wide with a terror that finally eclipsed his bravado. Silence descended upon the hall, broken only by the ragged breathing of the remaining combatants and the distant shouts of Kaelin's guards securing the castle. Yield. Kaelin's voice was a low growl, devoid of mercy. Thorn swallowed hard, his gaze darting around the room, finding no allies, only the triumphant faces of Kaelin's loyal guards and the wary expressions of the surviving courtiers. I yield, he rasped, defeat etched on his face. Kaelin withdrew his blade, signalling his guards to secure Thorn. The tension in the hall, which had been stretched taut, finally snapped. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, mingling with the lingering scent of smoke and fear. Elara, hidden behind an overturned table, watched as Kaelin surveyed the damage, his shoulders slumping slightly now that the immediate threat was contained. Exhaustion, she realized, was finally catching up to him. The aftermath was a blur of activity. Elder Rowan, his earlier skepticism replaced by a grim resolve, moved among the royal guards, issuing commands for the wounded and the prisoners. He caught Elara's eye, offering a brief, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, a silent apology for his past doubts. Later, as dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of bruised purple and pale gold, the court assembled once more, though the atmosphere was starkly different. The shattered decorations remained, a poignant reminder of the night's violence, but the fear had been replaced by a cautious triumph. Kaelin, though weary, stood tall and regal, his presence commanding the attention of every noble, every guard, every servant. He began to speak, his voice resonating with a quiet power that drew all eyes to him. Last night, this kingdom faced a betrayal of the highest order. Alpha Thorn, fueled by avarice and a twisted ambition, sought to tear down the very foundations of our peace. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. He failed. He failed because of the unwavering loyalty of my guards, the courage of my people, and the foresight of one who has too long been overlooked. Kaelin's eyes found Elara, who stood near the periphery, trying to blend into the shadows. A hush fell over the court as he gestured for her to step forward. Reluctantly, her heart pounding, Elara moved into the center of the hall, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes fixed upon her. Lady Elara, her lips a thin, disapproving line, glared openly. "Elara!" Kaelin's voice boomed, clear and strong. An Omega, a servant, whose warnings I once dismissed, yet whose instincts proved true. It was her keen observation, her unwavering dedication, that first brought Thorn's insidious plot to light, and when the battle raged, when our defences were pressed, it was her quick thinking, her resourceful diversion, that gave us the crucial moments needed to turn the tide. He paused, letting his words sink in. "Many among you," Kaelin continued, his voice hardening slightly as he addressed the assembly, measure worth by title, by lineage, by the alliances forged in gilded halls, but I tell you now, that is a superficial measure. True valor, true loyalty, comes from within. It is found in the quiet resolve of an Omega who risks everything to protect her king, her home. He stepped closer to Elara, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of profound respect that sent a ripple of murmurs through the court. "Elara," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "You are a hero. Your loyalty is more valuable than any political treaty. Your bravery more radiant than any inherited crest. From this day forward, know that you stand protected by this crown, cherished by this kingdom. Your place here is not temporary, nor is it earned through noble birth, but through courage and unwavering devotion." The declaration hung in the air, a powerful testament to a new order. Elara, overwhelmed, could only meet Kaelin's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. The whispers continued, but they were now tinged with a reluctant awe, a dawning realization that the king's word was absolute and Elara's star had irrevocably risen. A new dawn. The collective gasp that followed Caelin's declaration still echoed in the hallowed halls, but its reverberation was now one of acceptance, not shock. Elara, once a phantom of the palace, moved with a newfound grace, her steps no longer hurried and clandestine, but measured and confident. The whispers hadn't ceased, but their tone had shifted from derision to grudging admiration, laced with a healthy dose of fear directed at any who might dare cross the king's new protégé. Lady Lyra, once the most vocal detractor of Elara's presence, found herself in the awkward position of having to acknowledge the Omega's elevated status. She approached Elara by the grand archway leading to the royal library, her usual haughty demeanour marred by a noticeable tremor in her hands. Her silk gown, a vibrant emerald, seemed to dim beneath the weight of her unease. "Elara," Lyra began, her voice a reedy whisper, a stark contrast to her usual booming pronouncements. She cleared her throat, her gaze skittering away from Elara's direct stare. I must apologize." Elara remained silent, her expression unreadable. She simply waited, her posture open, yet firm. Lyra wrung her hands. "My words, my actions, they were ill-considered. I judged you unfairly, based on outdated notions. Your courage, your insight, you saved us all. You saved my children." The last words were barely audible, thick with an emotion Elara had never expected to hear from the formidable courtier. Vulnerability. "Thank you, Lady Lyra," Elara said, her voice soft but clear. She offered a small, genuine smile. "Your apology is accepted." It was a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of a turning tide, a silent acknowledgement that the old ways were crumbling, making space for something new. Lyra, visibly relieved, dipped her head in a swift, uncharacteristic bow before retreating, her emerald gown swirling around her. Later that afternoon, Elara sought solace in her garden. It was no longer a forgotten patch of weeds, but a vibrant tapestry of colour and fragrance, a living testament to her resilience. The roses Caelin had personally planted now bloomed in riotous shades of crimson and blush, their petals unfurling in the warm sunlight. The lavender bushes hummed with the drowsy buzz of bees, and the delicate bellflowers tinkled softly in the gentle breeze. Each bloom, each budding leaf, was a quiet triumph, mirroring the blossoming of her own spirit. She ran her fingers over a velvety rose petal, feeling the intricate texture, a profound sense of peace settling over her. This garden, once a refuge, was now a sanctuary, tended by her hands, nurtured by her heart, and protected by the king's unwavering decree. The scent of jasmine and honeysuckle mingled in the air, a sweet balm to her soul. She spent hours there, weeding, pruning, and simply breathing, letting the quiet strength of the earth ground her. The weight of court politics, the lingering echoes of Thorn's betrayal, all seemed to dissipate in the embrace of nature's enduring cycle. She was Elara, the girl who loved her garden, and now she was also Elara, the Omega who had saved a kingdom. The two identities, once separate and disparate, were now intricately woven, forming a stronger, more complete whole. The true test of her new standing came at the evening's court assembly. The great hall, usually a cacophony of hushed conversations and rustling silks, was hushed with an almost reverent silence as Caelin entered, his presence a palpable force. And beside him, not a step behind, but shoulder to shoulder, walked Elara. Her simple gown, a deep sapphire that brought out the startling clarity of her eyes, was elegant without being ostentatious. There were no jewels adorning her neck, no elaborate coiffure to distract. Her strength lay in her unadorned presence, her quiet dignity. As they ascended the dais, The gazes of the assembled courtiers followed them. Elder Rowan, his wise eyes no longer clouded by doubt, offered a respectful nod, a slight smile playing on his lips. Even the more rigid, tradition-bound nobles, who had once viewed her with disdain, now met her gaze with a newfound respect, or at the very least, a cautious deference. Caelan, his hand resting lightly on the small of Elara's back, surveyed his court. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble that filled the vast space. Let this be known, and let it be remembered. Elara stands beside me not by whim or favour, but by merit. Her wisdom, her courage, and her unwavering loyalty have proven invaluable to this kingdom. She is a shield, a guide, and a symbol of true strength. Any who forget this, forget their place within my court. His words hung in the air, a clear, unequivocal statement that brooked no argument. Elara felt a surge of warmth, not just from Caelan's touch, but from the realization that this was real. This was her new dawn. She met the gaze of the assembled court, her chin held high. The whispers were still there, but now they spoke of an Omega who had defied expectation, an unnoticed servant who had risen to become a pillar of the kingdom. She was no longer a ghost in the halls. She was a presence, acknowledged, respected, and undeniably, irrevocably here to stay.